A new show has joined the Colin's Last Stand family. It's called Knockback, and it's a retro-fueled podcast co-hosted by my brother, lead designer of Sesame Workshop, Dagan Moriarty. On Knockback, we discuss all of the things we love from our past: video games, television shows, movies, toys, books, and much more. If that sounds good to you, please subscribe to the show on podcast services or at soundcloud.com/CLS Knockback. And remember, Knockback, SideQuest, and Fireside Chats are fan-funded, so please consider showing your support for CLS on Patreon at patreon.com/ColinsLastStand, which nets you all sorts of perks, including early access to shows, exclusive videos and podcasts, and much more. Without you, none of these shows would exist. Thank you for your continued kindness, generosity, and support. Now, on to the show. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Colin's Last Stand SideQuest right here on YouTube. My name is Colin Moriarty. As always, I hope today's video finds you and yours very well. First of all, I'm sorry for any glow that's coming from this way. The sun is setting outside of my office window as I'm recording, and these goddamn curtains. Well, anyway, today's video is about video game violence and real-world violence and how the two might combine with one another. And this is obviously a decades-old conversation that has been once again reawoken, this time by Donald Trump, in light of the horrific school shooting down in Florida. I don't want to focus today's video only on the scientific literature and the research that has been kind of circulating since the 70s. A lot of it is nonsense. We're going to get into all of that. Don't worry about that. But I also want to focus on some of the people in the gaming industry that have helped perpetuate this neo-puritanical vision of video games and have attacked violence in video games for many years. And then when their hated enemy Donald Trump starts to get in on it, they act like they were never into it to begin with. That's called hypocrisy, and that's not going to happen. At least not on my imaginary watch. Blaming video games for insert terrible thing here is nothing new. This has been going on since the advent of home consoles in the 1970s right on up till today. And of course, video games haven't been the only entertainment-centric scapegoat for a society eager to blame all of its ills on anything but the individual. Comic books were the target in the 1950s. In the 1970s, an increase in crime was blamed on TV shows, culminating in the US Surgeon General linking violence on television with violence in the real world. The 1970s and 1980s saw wholesale attacks on completely innocuous forms of entertainment, like Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop games, which were often called demonic, apparently leading hordes of children down sinister paths. Music came under renewed assault in the 1980s and 1990s, resulting in a rating system not unlike the movie industry adopted when it became the unvogue societal scapegoat decades earlier. And as we all know, our very own ESRB rating system was born out of a government threat in the early to mid-90s that, if the video game industry didn't regulate itself and its products, the federal government would be happy to do it for them. After all, nothing says real-world, replicable violence like ripping someone's spine out. But unlike so much of the blaming and scapegoating of the past, which more often than not hailed from concerned parents and loosely organized activist groups, today's call to arms in regard to video game violence comes from the very top: President Donald Trump. In the wake of the horrific school shooting in Florida, Trump wondered aloud if video game violence isn't to blame. His conclusion? Perhaps games should have a rating system, one that has, unbeknownst to him, existed for 2.5 decades. For most, the story from there is how President Trump then announced that he was meeting with gaming executives to discuss this, something no one in the gaming industry was aware was happening. Listen, I don't want to make this all about President Trump. President Obama was also wary of violence in media and dedicated millions of dollars to studies focused on it. So both sides, as it were, are very much in on this. But I also don't want to sweep this renewed conversation under the rug. Just like that, we've been catapulted back years, even decades, to trite conversations that we hoped we'd left in the past, yet can never quite shake. Is gaming contributing to a culture of violence, not only here in the US, but around the world? The short answer is no. In fact, as video games have grown in popularity, real-world violence has fallen precipitously. But drawing such a conclusion is a little more complicated than just that, because there's plenty of blame to go around, including, ironically, with those who apparently play, love, and care about video games. As soon as the most primitive video games began to be blamed for the failings of modern society, starting perhaps with the notorious death race of the 1970s, science was there to try and project some truth into the equation one way or another. For instance, a widely reported on 1985 study showed the exact opposite of a link between video games and violence. The Chicago Tribune reported at the time that, quote, "The research suggests that heavy users of video games are not more neurotic than other children, nor are they more likely to be socially withdrawn, introverted, or more prone to use fantasy as an escape for their problems. Those who play the games frequently are not more extroverted or aggressive than their peers either," end quote. The report the Chicago Tribune cited went on to say that those who play games, whether casually or constantly, quote, "are, for the most part, healthy adolescents." For these players, video games have a calming rather than an excitatory effect in terms of aggressive and other energies, end quote. But it's not so cut and dry. Studies emerged, particularly in the 1990s during the Night Trap and Mortal Kombat hullabaloo, that seemed to contradict the aforementioned findings. A 1996 study surrounding Mortal Kombat and its sequel measured players' hostility levels after playing, and found that an average player felt and harbored more hostility after playing either game as opposed to a tactile game of billiards. Fast forward 10 years, and a 2006 study found the level of immersion a game provided a player with was directly correlated to increases in verbal and physical aggression. These and similar findings have often been conflated with violence, but that's absurd, of course. Aggression doesn't mean violence, and as Kotaku's Jason Schreier notes in his extensive collection of violent video game studies from 2013, quote, "Scientists have not found any links between video games and violence," end quote. At worst, it seems, video games may make select people more aggressive, but that's not a huge surprise. It appears that even the people at the very center of studying video games and their effects on the population can't agree on what their findings mean, nonetheless the veracity of said findings. They also can't explain how researchers are trying to find answers to something inherently abstract. This isn't figuring out how many electrons are whirling around a carbon atom. You can't calculate this. One proponent of linking video games and real-world violence, Professor Brad Bushman, acknowledges this tremendous flaw, especially in the face of often contradictory studies infested with abstract approaches to finding answers. Quote, "We can't give our participants knives and guns and see what they do with them. It's not ethical to do that. But we can use ethical measures in which they can harm another person physically or otherwise, and those measures consistently show that violent game players are more aggressive than non-violent game players. Are they more likely to stab someone? I don't know. Are they more likely to shoot somebody? I don't know. Are they more likely to rape someone? Beats me. Those are very rare events and we can't study them ethically, so I don't know what the link is between playing violent video games and violent criminal behavior," end quote. In short, no one actually has, or will have, any real answers. See, all of the studies and research in the world can't account for one thing in particular, something that's for some reason so often overlooked and ignored: math. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of people, if not a billion or more, have been exposed to and have played so-called violent video games in the last 4+ decades, and we aren't all killing each other. Right now, as we speak, there are nearly 80 million PS4s in homes, perhaps 30 million Xbox Ones, and hundreds of millions of gaming-capable PCs. Grand Theft Auto 5, as just a recent example, has sold at least 80 million copies since 2013. Similar to Death Race in the 70s, you can run over people in GTA 5. In fact, you can partake in all sorts of horrendous activities, stealing, murdering, destroying, and on and on and on. Not to be crass, but if, say, 100 people who played Grand Theft Auto 5 are influenced to go on real-world shooting sprees, is that the fault of the game or the fault of the individual? I mean, 79,999,900 people played the game and are totally fine. That doesn't seem like an indictment of the game to me, and to take it a step further, although this may be an unpopular step with some, you can say the same thing about guns. There are 325 million people in the US and 400 million guns. Gun violence is higher here than most other places in the world, but it's not as if the US is the Wild West either. It's almost as if people, and not lifeless objects that need people to use them, are the real issue. I saw a tweet circulating from my old friend and business partner Greg Miller, and I think it starts to get to the heart of the matter, though it doesn't go all the way. His tweet tells us not to get distracted when President Trump hones in on video games as a scapegoat, something Trump first prominently did back in 2012, mind you, and to continue to focus on mental health, gun control, and the NRA. Those are all fine things to focus on, but I'd take it a step further than Greg. Don't let President Trump's scapegoating distract you from the responsibility of the individual who perpetrated the crime. And don't let blaming everything around us remove the agency from the person who chose to use firearms on innocent people. Video games aren't to blame for this subhuman's crimes any more than the Second Amendment or the NRA are responsible for his crimes. He is responsible for his crimes. He made the choice to act like a monster. Guns didn't make him do it. Society didn't make him do it. Other people didn't make him do it. And rest assured, video games didn't make him do it either. It's time society make individuals take responsibility for their individual fuck-ups, and to stop giving people a litany of ways out of taking responsibility. Enough already. Why do we insist on doing this? It's like when overweight people blame food and corporations for them being fat. No, my friend, it's your fault you're fat. You feed yourself, right? I mean, I look like I'm 5 months pregnant, but that's not your fault. That's mine. Earlier, I said that there's plenty of blame to go around, and that's true. While video games aren't responsible for real-world violence, some people who cover video games are absolutely responsible for the perception that video game violence bleeds into the real world, hurting the medium from within. I know it's popular to attack Anita Sarkeesian, and I don't want to make calling out anyone here a habit on SideQuest, but it's absolutely hilarious to me that Miss Sarkeesian, who has criticized violence in video games for years, is now suddenly against scapegoating video games because President Trump is mimicking her. That's strange to me. It's weird to me that, for instance, she can criticize gratuitous violence and doom out of one side of her mouth, and then out of the other side talk about Trump scapegoating video games. Anita's entire career is scapegoating video games. Sorry, but you can't have it both ways. You helped create the neo-puritanical lens far too many people look at video games through these days. That's not lost on most of us. In short, Anita Sarkeesian and Donald Trump agree on video games, but for her, consistency isn't as important as politics. Of course, Miss Sarkeesian isn't the only one. Ben Kuchera recently wrote an article entitled, "I Can't Believe We're Still Blaming Video Games in 2018. Like, have you read your own website, Ben? I have, and I can believe why people are still blaming video games for real-world violence in 2018. Journalist Brian Crescente is also in on the act, on one hand promoting a piece for Rolling Stone, the outlet he works for, about how gaming doesn't cause violence, while back in 2013, while at Polygon, Mr. Crescente wrote that solving gun violence will require taking a look at violent video games' effects on said violence. Listen, I'm totally okay with you guys and gals having your opinions, but stick with them. Don't run away from what you've been putting into the ether for years, because the big bad boogeyman in Washington, D.C. agrees with you, 100%. It's too transparent for my tastes. Ultimately, at least here in the United States, video games are a protected form of entertainment. The Supreme Court has spoken loud and clear. Video games have free speech and free expression protections, period. So we don't have to worry about any interference from the federal government, just as we don't have to worry about conflicting studies and reports about all of the ills of video games going back decades. What we do have to worry about, as you can see, is perception. Perception from those who know nothing about games, perception from those who have access to grind, and perception from those in the gaming industry, who openly seek to gut the creativity of developers, only to run away from that stance once they find themselves in lockstep with someone they obsessively dislike. I think people should take personal responsibility for their actions, and I think it's horrible that society seeks to take the responsibility out of the shooter's hands, and instead project that responsibility on everything but him. It's shameful. I mean, I can tell you what caused the Florida shooting. A deranged madman, a bumbling local police force, and a woefully inept FBI. Here's what I can tell you didn't cause the shooting. Video games. It really is that simple. Well, that's it for this episode of Colin's Last Stand SideQuest. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, leave comments below. I'll be reading them. Thumb up the video if you liked it, thumb it down if you don't, and let your friends, family, acquaintances, and even enemies know about Colin's Last Stand SideQuest, Fireside Chats, and Knockback. Let them know about the majesty, the wonder, and the might of CLS. I will take no more of your time today, but I do appreciate the time you have given me. Again, I hope you and yours are very well, and I will see you next time for more SideQuest. Keep on gaming.